So if I go under the behavior sprocket and we expand on display and we enable simple helper, with this in conjunction with D helper under input means that whenever I press D, we can actually bring up the classic Boxcutter helper. Whenever it came to this helper, we initially created it very early on in Boxcutter's rebirth in 2.8, and we wanted to try to add some of the most important options to the user experience for them to be able to adjust on the fly. For example, if we press D and we change over to box, we can draw box. Press H to make it solid, we can press tab. Let's go inside our helper, we're able to check wedge. We're able to adjust the factor of our wedge very quickly just on the fly by getting in here. We even expanded on wedge by allowing users to be able to adjust the width on the fly. In addition to that, there's also options for users to be able to choose the snap angle that it snaps to whenever you press R to rotate. For example, we default to 15, but if we change it to something like 45, whenever I press R, we see that it snaps to 45, making rotation a lot easier. If I were to set it to 90, then rotation's even simpler, where basically a very small gesture is able to get this rotate around 180 degrees. So we'll just set that back to 15. The other thing is that tapering is enabled inside of this little mini helper during the draw. So just by clicking it, we're able to taper the shape. We're also able to drag the slider in order to taper it. And taper is a little bit different than wedge as far as how it's coded into Boxcutter. So its behavior is more akin to a modifier than it is to a shape modifier, which is something that we consider wedge to be. So also, taper doesn't persist across operations. For example, if we applied, wedge would continue being a thing, but taper would not. And that's where the persistent toggle comes in. If we were to check this and we complete the operation, then the next drawing we bring in will also be tapered and wedge. So we can just continuously taper and wedge. However, over time with Boxcutter, our needs for the helper grew and grew. For example, whenever we added grid, it definitely became apparent that the miniature helper that we had and the options that we aim to contain is a little bit menu blinding to users, and we needed something a little bit more contained, a little bit more flowing to get the intended Boxcutter experience across. And it also goes without saying that when we expanded on collections and added the ability to set up recall collections, that it also just made things all the more messier. And we could see that even though this is a very small panel, there's just a better way that this information could be conveyed to you, the user, and configured and dealt with on the fly that's probably a little bit more flowing. But that's pretty much where this mini helper ends, and more than likely we'll revisit this in the future and try to make a new miniature version. However, if you were to go under your display and you check simple helper, whenever you press D, you'll actually see that the new helper is just as accommodating as the old one. In fact, all the shape modifiers are just stacked up, and we can even just click X to remove all of them, taking us back to a vanilla box, and we can just begin working because we know for sure that we removed all those statuses by removing the X's for these particular shape modifiers in this particular instance. So as far as information conveyance, that's always our number one goal, but I wanted to do a small segment just talking about the mini helper and what led us to get to this point.